Picture this. You're standing perfectly still for hours, dressed in a bright red uniform and a towering black hat, while thousands of tourists snap photos and try everything they can think of to make you react. They wave. They shout. They make faces. Some even touch you, thinking you're just a statue put there for their entertainment. This is the daily reality for the Queen's Guard at Buckingham Palace. Most people see them as living mannequins, tourist attractions who aren't real soldiers. They couldn't be more wrong. What happened on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning in London would shatter every assumption people had about these silent sentinels. It would transform mockery into respect, laughter into stunned silence, and turn a routine day into a moment that would be talked about for generations. The man at the center of this story never expected to become a hero. He was just doing his job, standing guard, protecting what mattered most. But sometimes being in the right place at the right time with the right training can mean the difference between life and death for complete strangers. This is the true story of Guardsman James Mitchell, and the day his military precision and lightning-fast reflexes saved lives while the world was busy laughing at his funny hat. James Mitchell had been dreaming of this moment since he was 8 years old. Standing at attention outside Buckingham Palace, wearing the iconic red tunic and bearskin hat of the Queen's Guard, he felt a surge of pride that almost broke his perfectly composed expression. Almost. The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as James took his position at the main gate. His rifle was perfectly positioned, his posture ramrod straight, and his face set in a neutral expression that had taken months to master during training. To the casual observer, he looked like every other guardsman who had stood in this exact spot for over 350 years. But James carried something extra with him that morning, a letter from his grandfather tucked safely in his breast pocket. His grandfather, William Mitchell, had served in the same regiment during World War II. The letter, written just before William's death 6 months earlier, contained advice that James had read dozens of times. Remember, lad, you're not just standing there for show. You're protecting something precious. Every moment you're on duty, you represent centuries of service and sacrifice. Never forget that your job matters, even when others don't understand. The first tourists began arriving around 9 o'clock. James watched from his peripheral vision as they approached, cameras already clicking before they were even close enough to get a decent shot. A group of teenagers from America were among the first, their voices carrying easily across the morning air. "Oh my God, look at his hat. It's like so tall," squealed one girl, pointing directly at James. "Do you think it's heavy?" Her friend laughed, pulling out her phone to start recording. "I bet I can make him smile. Watch this." She started making exaggerated faces, sticking out her tongue and crossing her eyes while her friends giggled behind her. James had been through this exact scenario dozens of times during his 6 months of service. The training had prepared him well. He kept his breathing steady, his eyes focused straight ahead, and his mind occupied with military protocols and procedures. The key was to think of something else entirely. Usually, he ran through weapons maintenance procedures in his head or recalled the specifications of various military vehicles. But today felt different somehow. Perhaps it was his grandfather's letter, or maybe it was the particularly persistent nature of this group of tourists. But James found himself more aware of his surroundings than usual. His senses seemed heightened, picking up sounds and movements that normally would have blended into the background noise of central London. The American teenagers were quickly joined by a family from Germany. The father, a large man with a booming laugh, seemed determined to test James's resolve. He waved enthusiastically, called out greetings in broken English, and even pretended to march alongside James during a brief period when the guard was required to take several steps to the left as part of his routine patrol pattern. "Heinrich, leave the poor man alone," his wife chided, but she was smiling as she said it, clearly entertained by her husband's antics. He cannot be real person," Heinrich replied, his accent thick with good humor. "Look, he does not even blink. Is robot, I think." More tourists gathered, drawn by the commotion. James noticed this was happening earlier in the day than usual. Typically, The crowds didn't build up until closer to noon, when the changing of the guard ceremony drew larger numbers. But something about today seemed to be attracting people earlier and in greater numbers. A group of school children arrived with their teacher, who was trying to organize them for a group photo. The children, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, were buzzing with excitement. They had clearly been told about the famous guards who don't move or speak, and they seemed to view James as a fascinating puzzle to be solved. "Miss Johnson, why doesn't he move?" asked a small boy with gap-toothed grin. "It's his job, Tommy," the teacher explained patiently. "He's protecting the Queen's palace, so he has to stay very still and alert." "But what if he needs the toilet?" asked a girl with pigtails, causing the entire group to erupt in giggles. James found himself fighting back his own smile at that one. The innocence of children always tested his resolve more than the deliberate attempts by adults to break his concentration. There was something pure about their curiosity that made his job both harder and more meaningful at the same time. As the morning progressed, the crowd continued to grow. James began to notice patterns in the behavior. Most tourists followed a predictable routine. Approach cautiously, take photos from a respectful distance, maybe wave or say hello, then move on when they realized he wouldn't respond. But there were always a few who seemed to take his lack of response as a personal challenge. One man, clearly intoxicated despite the early hour, became increasingly aggressive in his attempts to get a reaction. He started by making jokes, then moved on to increasingly loud and inappropriate comments. When those failed, he began to step closer to James, eventually standing just inches away from his face. "I bet you're not even real," the man slurred, his breath reeking of alcohol and stale cigarettes. "Probably just some wax dummy they put out here to fool the tourists." James could feel the man's breath on his face, could see every detail of his bloodshot eyes and unshaven cheeks. Every instinct in his body was telling him to step back, to speak up, to do something to create distance between himself and this unpredictable stranger. But his training held firm. He remained perfectly still, his breathing steady, his expression unchanged. The drunk man reached out as if to touch James's face, but before his hand could make contact, 2 of James's fellow guardsmen appeared as if from nowhere. They moved with practiced efficiency, flanking the intoxicated tourist and guiding him away from the area with quiet but firm authority. The man protested loudly, but he was clearly outnumbered and outmatched. Within minutes, he had been escorted well away from the palace gates. James felt a surge of gratitude toward his colleagues, but he couldn't show it. The incident was handled so smoothly that most of the tourists barely noticed what had happened. This was the invisible network of protection that surrounded every guardsman on duty. They were never truly alone, even when they appeared to be standing in isolation. The crowd that had witnessed the brief confrontation seemed more respectful after that. Perhaps seeing the drunk man removed had reminded them that the guards were real people doing a real job, not just tourist attractions. The atmosphere around James's post became noticeably calmer, with fewer attempts to provoke reactions and more genuine appreciation for what he represented. A group of veterans approached around mid-morning, and James could immediately tell they were military men even before he saw their regimental pins and heard their conversations. They moved with the same purposeful bearing he had been trained to maintain, and they looked at him with understanding rather than curiosity. "Royal Regiment of Fusiliers?" asked one of the older men, reading the insignia on James's uniform. "Fine Regiment. I served with the Welsh Guards myself, back in the 70s. His companions nodded appreciatively. They took their photos respectfully, maintained appropriate distances, and spoke in the quiet tones of men who understood the importance of military discipline. Before they left, the Welsh Guard veteran caught James's eye for just a moment and gave him an almost imperceptible nod of respect. It was the kind of recognition that meant more than 1,000 tourist photos. As noon approached, James could feel the energy in the air beginning to change. The changing of the guard ceremony was still hours away, but the crowds were building in anticipation. Street performers were setting up in the nearby areas, hoping to capitalize on the increased foot traffic. Vendors were wheeling their carts into position, loaded with postcards, miniature guards' hats, and other London-themed souvenirs. James had learned to read the rhythms of the tourist crowds during his months on duty. He could predict the ebb and flow of attention, the times when he would be virtually ignored, and the times when he would be surrounded by dozens of curious onlookers. Today felt like it was building towards something bigger than usual, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what was different. His training had taught him to trust his instincts, even while maintaining his stoic exterior. Something in the air, some subtle change in the normal patterns of activity around the palace, was triggering his heightened awareness. It wasn't anything he could identify specifically, just a feeling that today would be different from all the other days he had stood guard. The letter from his grandfather crinkled slightly against his chest as he adjusted his stance in the barely perceptible way that was allowed during extended periods of standing. The words came back to him. Your job matters, even when others don't understand. James had no way of knowing that within the next few hours, those words would prove to be more prophetic than either he or his grandfather could have imagined. The crowd around him continued to grow, their laughter and chatter creating a backdrop of normalcy that would soon be shattered by events no one could have predicted. The stage was set for a day that would transform not just James's understanding of his role, but the public perception of the Queen's Guard forever. And it would all begin with what seemed like just another group of tourists looking for a memorable photo. The crowd had swelled to nearly 300 people by 1 o'clock in the afternoon. James had been on duty for 4 hours, and his legs were beginning to feel the familiar ache that came with extended periods of standing at attention. But his training had conditioned him well. He could maintain this position for several more hours if necessary, drawing on techniques of mental focus and physical endurance that had been refined over centuries of military tradition. Among the sea of faces surrounding his post, James noticed a family that stood out from the typical tourist crowd. They weren't taking photos or trying to get his attention. Instead, they seemed nervous, constantly looking around as if searching for someone or something. The father kept checking his phone with increasing frequency, while the mother held tightly to the hands of 2 young children who appeared tired and confused. Something about their behavior triggered James's heightened awareness. During his military training, instructors had emphasized the importance of recognizing patterns that didn't fit normal circumstances. This family's anxiety seemed out of place among the generally cheerful atmosphere of tourists and sightseers. The father was a middle-aged man with graying temples, wearing a wrinkled business suit that suggested he had been traveling. The mother appeared to be in her 30s, with worried eyes that kept darting toward the palace gates and then back to the crowd. The children, a boy and girl who looked to be around 6 and 8 years old, stayed close to their parents with the kind of subdued behavior that suggested they had been given serious instructions about staying together. James couldn't hear their conversation from his position, but he could see the father showing something on his phone to his wife, pointing toward different areas around the palace grounds. The woman's expression grew more worried with each passing minute, and she began pulling the children even closer to her side. Other tourists continued their usual activities around James's post, seemingly oblivious to the family's distress. A group of Japanese tourists had set up an elaborate photo session, taking turns posing next to James while their friends snapped pictures from multiple angles. College students from somewhere in Eastern Europe were attempting to have a conversation in broken English about British history, clearly trying to impress each other with their limited knowledge of royal traditions. But James's attention kept returning to the anxious family. Military training had taught him that unusual behavior often preceded significant events, and something about this situation was activating every instinct he had developed during his service. The family's positioning near the palace gates wasn't random. They had chosen a spot that provided clear sight lines in multiple directions while keeping them close to what most people would consider a position of safety. Around 1:30, James noticed new arrivals that made his internal alarm bells ring even louder. Three men in dark clothing had positioned themselves at different points around the palace perimeter, and their behavior was anything but typical tourist activity. They weren't taking photos, weren't engaging with other visitors, and weren't showing any interest in the palace itself. Instead, they seemed to be conducting some kind of surveillance, their attention focused on the crowd rather than the historic building. One of the men had positioned himself near the Victoria Memorial, another by the main palace gates about 50 yards from James's position, and the third had taken up a spot along the fence line where he had a clear view of the entire area. They weren't standing together, weren't communicating obviously, but something about their positioning and behavior suggested coordination. James's training in threat assessment began kicking into high gear. During his time in the military, he had served a tour in Afghanistan where recognizing potential threats was literally a matter of life and death. The same instincts that had kept him and his unit alive in hostile territory were now screaming warnings about the current situation. The three men weren't obviously armed, and their clothing didn't suggest any immediate threat. But their behavior patterns, the way they moved, their positioning, their obvious awareness of each other despite maintaining distance, all pointed to some kind of planned activity. James found himself cataloging details about each man, heights, builds, distinctive features, anything that might be important if the situation escalated. Meanwhile, the nervous family had moved closer to James's position. The father was now standing just a few feet away, still checking his phone repeatedly. James could see that the man's hands were shaking slightly, and sweat was beading on his forehead despite the relatively cool London afternoon. "Sarah, I think we should go back to the hotel," the father said to his wife, his voice carrying just far enough for James to overhear. "This isn't working out the way we planned." "But, David, he said he would meet us here," the woman replied, her own anxiety clear in her voice. "What if something's happened? What if he can't find us?" James's mind began working through possibilities. The family was clearly waiting for someone, and their increasing nervousness suggested that whoever they were expecting was overdue. Combined with the suspicious behavior of the three positioned men, the situation was developing into something that could potentially be dangerous. His grandfather's letter pressed against his chest, reminding him of the words about protecting something precious. James realized that his duty might extend beyond just standing guard over the palace building. He might need to protect the innocent people who had chosen to seek safety near his post. The crowd around the palace had continued to grow throughout the afternoon, and James estimated there were now close to 500 people in the immediate area. Families with children, elderly tourists, groups of teenagers, couples on romantic trips to London, all of them completely unaware that anything might be wrong. They continued taking photos, chatting happily, and enjoying what they assumed was a perfectly normal day of sightseeing. At approximately 2:15, James saw the man positioned near the Victoria Memorial reach into his jacket and speak into what appeared to be a small radio or communication device. The movement was quick and subtle, but James's trained eye caught it immediately. Within seconds, he noticed similar movements from the other two men, brief, coordinated communications that confirmed his suspicions about their coordination. The nervous family had become increasingly agitated. The father was now pacing in a small area, constantly checking his phone and looking around desperately. The mother had crouched down to speak to the children, and James could see that she was trying to prepare them for something, possibly to leave the area quickly if necessary. James faced a crucial decision. His orders were clear. Maintain position, don't speak, don't react to civilian situations. The Queen's Guard had strict protocols about maintaining their stoic presence regardless of circumstances. Breaking character could result in serious disciplinary action, potentially ending his military career. But his training went deeper than just the ceremonial aspects of his role. He was a soldier first, and soldiers were trained to recognize and respond to threats. The combination of the suspicious men, the frightened family, and the large crowd of innocent civilians was creating a situation that demanded action. James began implementing a technique he had learned during his combat training. using peripheral vision and slight body positioning changes to gather more information while maintaining his outward appearance of stillness. He shifted his weight in the barely perceptible way that was allowed during extended guard duty, giving him a slightly better angle to observe all three suspicious men simultaneously. The man near the main gates was now openly watching the nervous family, his attention focused specifically on them rather than on the general crowd. This confirmed James's growing suspicion that the family wasn't just randomly anxious. They were connected to whatever was developing. At 2:30, everything began to accelerate rapidly. The father received a phone call that caused his face to go completely white. He grabbed his wife's arm and spoke to her urgently in what sounded like frantic whispers. The children immediately sensed the change in their parents' demeanor and began to look scared themselves. Simultaneously, the three positioned men began moving. Not quickly or obviously, but with the kind of coordinated movement that suggested the execution of a planned operation. They were converging on the area where James stood guard, using the crowd as cover while maintaining their positions relative to each other. James realized that he was about to become witness to something that would test every aspect of his training, his courage, and his understanding of what it truly meant to serve and protect. The crowd around him continued their cheerful tourist activities, completely unaware that the next few minutes would transform their pleasant afternoon into something none of them would ever forget. The weight of his grandfather's letter seemed heavier against his chest as James prepared for what was coming. Everything he had been trained for, both as a ceremonial guard and as a combat soldier, was about to be put to the ultimate test. And the lives of hundreds of innocent people might depend on how well he had absorbed the lessons that had been passed down through generations of British military service. The stage was set for a confrontation that would either validate every assumption people had about the Queen's Guard being mere ceremonial figures, or shatter those assumptions forever. James Mitchell, the young man who had dreamed of this moment since childhood, was about to discover what it truly meant to stand guard over something precious. At exactly 2:47 in the afternoon, James Mitchell's world exploded into chaos. The first indication that something was seriously wrong came when the father from the nervous family suddenly shouted across the crowd in what sounded like Russian or Eastern European language. His voice carried a tone of desperate warning that cut through the cheerful chatter of tourists like a knife. Within seconds, the three men who had been positioned around the palace grounds began moving with deadly purpose. James watched in horror as the man nearest to the main gates reached into his jacket and pulled out what was unmistakably a weapon. The afternoon sunlight glinted off metal as he raised his hand, and James realized with crystal clarity that this was no longer a situation he could handle by following ceremonial protocols. In that split second, as hundreds of innocent tourists continued their conversations and photo-taking completely unaware of the danger materializing around them, James Mitchell made a decision that would haunt and define the rest of his life. He broke 350 years of tradition. Get down. Everyone get down now. James's voice exploded across the palace courtyard with the authority of a combat veteran who had faced life and death situations in Afghanistan. The power and urgency in his shout immediately cut through every conversation, stopped every camera click, and turned hundreds of heads toward his position. For a moment, the entire scene froze like a photograph. Tourists stood with their mouths open, staring at the red-coated guard who had just shattered every expectation they had about the silent, stoic figures they had come to see. Children stopped mid-giggle, adults lowered their phones, and even street performers paused their acts to turn toward the source of the commanding voice. But James didn't have time to consider the shock his outburst had caused. His military training had kicked in completely, overriding every ceremonial protocol he had learned. He could see the armed man near the gates was raising his weapon toward the crowd, specifically toward the area where the frightened family was standing. Without hesitation, James dropped his ceremonial rifle and launched himself forward, his bright red uniform and towering bearskin hat making him look like some kind of surreal action hero as he charged through the crowd of stunned tourists. His years of physical training, combat experience, and military conditioning had prepared his body to respond instantly to crisis situations. The tourists finally began to understand that something was terribly wrong. Screams erupted from multiple directions as people spotted the weapon and began scrambling for cover. Parents grabbed their children, elderly visitors struggled to move quickly, and the organized chaos of a crowd in panic began to take hold of the palace courtyard. James covered the 50 yards between his post and the armed man in what felt like seconds. His combat training had taught him that in situations like this, speed and decisiveness were the difference between life and death. The man with the weapon was focused on the family and hadn't expected the guard to break character and charge toward him. The collision when James tackled the armed man was devastating. Despite his ceremonial uniform and formal appearance, James was in peak physical condition and had the element of surprise on his side. Both men went down hard on the cobblestones, with James using techniques he had learned during hand-to-hand combat training to control his opponent and secure the weapon. But the situation was far from over. As James struggled with the first attacker, the other two men began closing in on their position. The crowd of tourists, initially frozen by shock, was now in full panic mode. People were running in every direction, some trying to get away from the palace entirely, others seeking shelter behind cars, monuments, or anything that might provide protection. James heard police sirens in the distance, but he knew that backup was still several minutes away. In crisis situations, minutes could mean the difference between a contained incident and a massacre. He managed to gain control of the first man's weapon, but as he looked up, he could see the second attacker approaching with his own gun drawn. "Police! Armed police!" James shouted at the top of his lungs, hoping to either scare off the remaining attackers or at least warn any civilians who were still in the line of fire. His voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded troops in combat situations, and several tourists who had been paralyzed by fear began moving towards safety. The second attacker hesitated for a moment, apparently uncertain whether James was actually a police officer or just a guard. That moment of hesitation was all James needed. Using the weapon he had taken from the first man, he took aim with the steady hands of a trained marksman and fired a warning shot into the air. The sound of gunfire in central London had an immediate and dramatic effect. Every remaining tourist who hadn't already fled began running for cover with renewed urgency. Car alarms began blaring, adding to the chaos and confusion. But more importantly, the warning shot had alerted every police officer and security official in the area that this was a genuine emergency requiring immediate response. James could hear the approaching sirens getting louder, and within 30 seconds of his warning shot, armed police officers began appearing from multiple directions. They had been stationed in strategic locations around the palace area, but James's decisive action had bought crucial time and prevented what could have been a catastrophic attack on innocent civilians. The remaining two attackers, realizing that their operation had been completely compromised and that they were now facing trained armed police rather than helpless tourists, attempted to flee. But the coordinated response of London's security forces, combined with the chaos that made escape difficult, resulted in both men being apprehended within minutes. As the immediate danger passed, James found himself sitting on the cobblestones, still wearing his full ceremonial uniform, including the towering bearskin hat, but now looking like he had been through a war zone. His red tunic was torn and dirty, his hands were scraped from the struggle, and he was breathing heavily from the adrenaline and physical exertion. The nervous family who had been the apparent target of the attack approached James as the police took the attackers into custody. The father, tears streaming down his face, tried to find words to express his gratitude. "You saved our lives," he managed to say in heavily accented English. "My family, my children, we owe you everything." James learned later that the family had been fleeing from a dangerous situation in their home country, and the three attackers had been sent to silence them before they could testify in an international criminal case. What had appeared to be random tourist anxiety had actually been justified fear for their lives. The aftermath of the incident was unlike anything James could have imagined. Within hours, video footage taken by tourist phones had spread across social media worldwide. The image of a Queen's Guard in full ceremonial dress charging into action to protect innocent civilians became one of the most shared and discussed pieces of content in internet history. News crews from around the world descended on London to report on the story. The headline, "They laughed at the Royal Guard," until what happened next stopped everyone cold, appeared in newspapers and websites in dozens of languages. James Mitchell, the young man who had dreamed of serving in the Queen's Guard since childhood, had become an international symbol of courage and duty. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from his own regiment and the royal family themselves. In a private ceremony held at Buckingham Palace, James received commendations for his actions that went far beyond typical military honors. He had not only upheld the finest traditions of the Queen's Guard, but had demonstrated that the ceremony and tradition were backed by real skill, real courage, and real commitment to protecting others. The letter from his grandfather, which had remained safely tucked in his breast pocket through the entire ordeal, took on new meaning in the weeks that followed. William Mitchell's words about protecting something precious had proven prophetic in ways neither grandfather nor grandson could have anticipated. James returned to his duties as a member of the Queen's Guard, but the experience had changed both him and the public's perception of his role forever. Tourists still came to take photos and try to make the guards react, but there was a new level of respect and understanding. The red uniforms and tall black hats were no longer seen as mere costume pieces worn by living statues, but as the professional attire of highly trained soldiers ready to act when duty called. The incident became a defining moment in the modern history of the Queen's Guard, proving that centuries of tradition and ceremony were not just for show, but were supported by real military capability and genuine dedication to service. James Mitchell had shown the world that sometimes the most important heroism comes from those who stand quietly at their posts, ready to act when others need protection most. Years later, when James told the story to his own children, he would always end with the same lesson his grandfather had tried to teach him. That standing guard isn't about being seen or recognized, but about being ready to do what's right when it matters most. On that Tuesday afternoon in London, when hundreds of innocent people needed someone to stand between them and danger, James Mitchell had proven worthy of every tradition his uniform represented.